In this video, we're going to look at the Yahwist creation story. Remember, the Yahwist were royal scribes founded back in the time of King David. This school of royal scribes that King David established, though, continued through King Solomon and his sons and their successors right up to the time of the Babylonian Empire, Babylonian exile, and then went into exile in Babylon. So this is a continuous tradition, and by the time the exile had come, they were seen as preservers of the entire written tradition of their school. So notice now, by the time after a few hundred years, they're going back and they can check the old stories and the old written accounts and things like that. They're seen very much as preservers of their tradition. So let's look at the Yahwist creation story here. There's two major elements in the story, two major parts. The first one is largely contained in chapter 2, and that is the story of the creation and the Garden of Eden and humans. It's kind of the idyllic scene. It's when things are great. And then the second part of the story, which happens in chapter 3 of Genesis, is kind of where things went wrong. It's a story of human weakness, but also God's compassion and continued care for human beings despite what they did or did not do. The story was not created in a bubble. It draws on various Near Eastern myths, and it sets the stage for the particularly Israelite story of God's covenant with Abram and his descendants forever, and tells why we need this covenant so bad. So if we start off in Genesis 4 and 5, we find this barren earth. This would have been something that would have touched a nerve with the ancient Israelites because this was the biggest challenge in their life. How to get enough water to irrigate their fields, or to feed their flocks, or just to provide enough to drink for their families every day. It was an area that was susceptible to frequent drought, and many of the areas that the Israelite tribes came from were quite arid. Okay, so you start just with this barren earth, and then God causes a mist to rise up and water the earth. Now, this would have been nice. I mean, this would have been paradise for the ancient Israelites. Just the idea that there's water everywhere, just that you could breathe easy, kind of. I don't know if you've ever spent a long time in an arid region, but you do tend to dry out. And people who live in arid regions do tend to have some kind of way to deal with this. They do usually have some kind of steam rooms that they build or something like that to kind of rehydrate their body from the breath in. All right, so they have this nice scene now with this mist that covers the water, and then God forms the human being, right? He forms Adam, the human being, out of Adamah, right? Which means earth. So there's a little play on words there, and the Yahwist writer likes to do that. You might say, well, what's the big deal? The words sound the same. But play on words are for some reason convincing. Make people really think about things and think there must be something to them. We see this today when we just look at the roots of different words. I remember hearing someone say once in some kind of lecture or something, self-help video or something, I don't remember, I heard it, but they said, your responsibility is your ability to respond. And just clicked with me at the time. I said, wow, hey, look at that. Look how those words go together. And so this play on words was something that the Yahwist writers seem particularly fond of, and we'll see it a few more places throughout the Yahwist works. Okay, But you also, besides the little play on word, is you get a intimacy between humans and the earth. Humans are made from the earth. You'll see later in this creation story that humans are to care for the earth. So it's kind of almost like we're taking care of ourselves, right? It's not man versus nature here, right? It's man came from nature. It's probably something that is akin with our contemporary worldview, right? We see a similar scene in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where one of the gods forms human beings from clay. That Epic of Gilgamesh is a Mesopotamian myth. Okay, then God breathes life into the human's nostrils. He breathes his life, his breath, right into him, and the human becomes a living being. Right? Again, there's a scene like this in the Enuma Elish. The Yahwist writers aren't inventing the wheel. No, they're using a lot of different sources. Some of them from Canaanite traditions, which again, remember with the Canaanite stuff, a lot of the Israelites used to be Canaanites, right? And then you also have traditions of these great civilizations like the Sumerians and the Mesopotamians. Anyway, now you have Adam, right? The human, a living being, and God's going to plant a nice garden with beautiful and nourishing plants all over. And also the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So at that point, there's a little break in the story, and we're told about the rivers, the four great rivers. Now, all the four rivers are said to be from the one source, the river that God causes to flow out of Eden. So what they're saying here is that all this water, which is life for the people in the ancient world, is from God. So God is the source of the fertility and life in the world, right? And so this is also going to discourage Israelites from thinking that fertility comes from participation in Canaanite or Mesopotamian cults, right? A lot of these, we already saw a little bit in the Enuma Elish how the idea that the crops would grow based on the procreative acts of the gods, right? So there were things that people would try to do to induce the procreative activities of the gods, and then they thought that would make the crops grow. And you might say, well, that's really silly. But again, if let's say someone performs one of these cultic acts that are supposed to increase the procreative activity of the gods, and then that next year crops grow, hey, people say, look, it worked, right? We did it last year, we had crops. And we did it last year when we had crops, and the other year, not that many people did it, and we didn't have that many crops. So, again, to the ancient mind, correlation would often seem cause. We are not beyond that ourselves. Don't fool yourself. You see that type of thing going on a lot with various medical treatments that we have today, or other health diets and things like that. People simply see a correlation. This person lost weight eating these foods. Okay, let's just eat all that food for a month. It might not have a very logical basis, but it's convincing enough, right? People just see the correlation and they go with it. All right. So this was a big challenge for the Yahwist writers. They really wanted to get people more into the Israelite religion, into the Israelite tradition, into worship of Yahweh, and they wanted to get them away from participating in these other local cults. So in verse 15 then of chapter 2, the human, Adam, is identified as the one who will work and keep the garden. So this is a nice image of what a human being is for, what a human being is about. He's not a slave like in the Enuma Elish. The gods didn't create the human being because they didn't want to do the work themselves, right? No, here's got this nice garden, and God created the garden, and now he's going to keep the garden. He's sharing in the life of God in that way. It makes sense that people that were inspired by this tradition, the priestly writers wrote that man was created in the image and likeness of God. It's the same idea. You can see it there, which makes sense. Since the priestly writers were using these Yahwist writings as inspiration for their Christian story. Okay, in verse 16 and 17, we see that the plants are all there, and they are all good for eating, with the exception of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which never should be eaten from. There's no reason to give it. It's just, you're not supposed to do it, right? Interesting scene here. God creates this garden, everything, and it's good. He gives it to the humans. Eat everything that's here. Just don't eat this tree. Don't eat the fruit of this tree. Why? There's no reason given. In verses 18 to 20, God notices that it's not good for the human to be alone, right? Again, what do you have here? You have a God that cares about these human beings, right? In this case, there's just one of them, but he cares about him. He says, well, this is not working out for this guy, right? Let's do something. Again, this is very different than the Mesopotamian myths, where gods, create humans to do their work for them, and then you will see in the Mesopotamian version of the flood story, they try to flood the earth to kill the humans because the humans are too noisy. They're annoyed by the humans. They kind of detest them. God in the Israelite creation myths cares about the humans. He can tell Adam's a little bummed out, something's not quite right. And so he wants to make him a helper like near to him. Right? Now, Burge points out that this is a sign also of the communal nature of human beings, right? That it's not good for a human to be alone. Our human beings were kind of made, it's part of our essence. Remember that for the ancient people, the origins of something showed what it really was. So, true human nature, if you really want to understand a human being, the story is saying, a human being is a person who was made for community. A person who is suitable to be in communion with others. Right? So God creates all the animals. There's no breathing into their nostrils, but they're acknowledged as living beings. Adam names all the animals, right? Which both, kind of verifies their status as living beings. They all get names. But also shows him sharing in the divine act of creation in a certain way. Again, it's another image, likeness and image of God thing that inspires the priestly writer later, right? However, none of them make a suitable partner. None of the animals are quite right. So, you see how much God cares. He just doesn't say, well, I tried. Sorry, buddy. I guess you'll just kind of live a not quite fulfilled life. No, this is the Garden of Eden, and God is going to keep working on the process. And so he forms Isha out of the rib of Ish. Now here's another play on words, and now we have the word not Adam, which was actually human being, but now we have Aisha, woman, and Ish, man, right? So the woman is formed out of the rib of the man. So you have that play on words. Again, people say, oh yeah, Isha, oh, that makes perfect sense. But there's also might be some reference to just an ancient idea about how human beings were created, some kind of ancient etiology or origin story about the human nature, because they found in archaeological digs around Jericho these little figurines, and the little figurines are kind of have sticks with like clay molded around them. So this might represent some very ancient idea about the formation of human beings. Okay, in verse 23 and 24, the man now, Adam, is recognizing the woman as bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. And verse 24 goes on to say, that is why a man leaves his mother and father and clings to his wife. So again, we might have this recognition of the communal nature of humanity. Say bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. That Adam is realizing that him and Eve belong together, but also an etiology or an origin story of marriage. Right? This will explain why people get married and they go to be with their spouses and detach from their mother and father. Burge doesn't specifically talk about this at this point, but I thought it was important to mention, that this could also be understood as a statement of the equality of men and women, right? Where Adam is saying a woman, Adam is now the man, right? We have the genders now. Adam's saying the man, the woman is the bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. She's the same kind of being I am. It's not, hey, man is one thing and then woman is another thing, right? He said, no, she's bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. Seems like there might be a statement of the equal dignity of male and female. Now, that doesn't mean that is living on throughout Israelite culture, right, throughout history, but it does mean that it's being recognized as part of the original state, right, of what human beings are. So on an essential level, the authors might be saying, hey, we know that men and women are of equal dignity. Then finally, verse 25 in chapter 2, the man and the woman, Adam and Eve, as Eve will come to known as Eve, named Eve by Adam, they're naked and unashamed. And that's kind of a bridge to the next part of the story, because right now everything is created good. They're just living this life in paradise, and they are naked and unashamed. Next part of the story, they're going to be naked and ashamed. What happened? All right, well, before we get there, let's just take a look a little bit at this idea of being naked and unashamed. Burge says that it reflects their open, unself-conscious, intimate relationship with God and one another. So it shows like it didn't bother them to be different, is the way I like to think about it. Right? They didn't think there was anything wrong with being different. They were fine with themselves the way they were. They had a good relationship with one another. They had a good relationship with God. We'll see he comes down and talks with them in the afternoon. It didn't bother them to be who they were. They were open about it. They didn't have anything to hide, right? All these kind of things are symbolized in their state of being naked and unashamed. But it's also like a contrast there, how it used to be, right? Because the people hearing this story, they're like, well, we are ashamed to be naked, right? So it brings up the question, like, how do we get this way? Why, right? Burge calls the Garden of Eden scene in Genesis 2 a picture of human life before alienation, right? Before something happened in which we started to see ourselves as defensive in the face of the world. We started to think, oh, there's something wrong with us, I'm different and that's bad, right? So before we became very self-conscious, and also before our relationships were strained, both with other people and with God. So in general, Genesis 2 and 3 can be called an etiology, right? An etiology is an origin story, and Burge gets specific about it by calling it etiology for the disruption of human experience in its relationship with God and with one another. So the assumption is that at one time we did have a good relationship. At one time, originally man was created in an intimacy with God, themselves, and the other humans, and really all of nature, right? So something happened there, right? Now notice, Burge goes on to say this is not a description of the first sin committed by a historical person. This is not a historical account. Again, I don't think it was intended to be a historical account. If the priestly editors, at least the priestly editors, would have understood it as a as a historical account, then they would have changed things around a little to make it fit with their own creation story, or better yet, change their own creation story to make it fit with this one. Right? They weren't concerned with either of that, because it doesn't seem that they were reading it or think that either of these stories were supposed to be understood the way that someone understands a historical story today. Right? Their question would have been, what does it mean? What does it mean to be a human being? What does it mean to have a relationship with God? And in this particular case, how do we deal with this new life? Like, how do we get from, the people who God freed from kings into loyal subjects of a king? We need to know more, right? And so the story gives the people deep and profound understanding about what it means to be a human being. And notice there's a change of context, right? It starts in Eden, and then it goes to not Eden. That's what we'll see in chapter 3, right? So the idea of transitions is something that is important in the story, and that's what the people are going through in their life. And you'll see that God continues to care for people during transitions, even if they made mistakes, even if they're ashamed. He's not ashamed of them. He loves them and takes care of them. And so the genre of the story is properly understood as a myth. And please, this is another place where our typical everyday use of a word is not the same as the way we mean it in the biblical studies, right? When we're doing theology. I know myth is commonly used as something that is a falsehood in our culture, like show Mythbusters, right? If you call something a myth in everyday conversation, you're just saying it's not true. That's not what we mean by a myth in the literary sense. We mean a myth as Sister Burge describes it here. A story whose task is to present the deepest truth of what it means to be a human being. So a myth is a story that uses symbol to explain meaning. And that's what this story does. This story helps people find meaning in their life using symbols still today.